Hello and welcome to Turning Point Church. Now, whether you're joining us for the first time or a regular viewer or part of our community, we hope and pray you find something uplifting in our message today. Now, humans are a social animal, and for thousands of years there's been nothing we enjoy more than being together, having fun and sharing with each other our successes and our troubles. Do you remember when we were still able to do that? Pre-lockdown days, sitting with friends and family around the dinner table, down the pub or in the cafe with a bunch of pals. Nowadays, we might be meeting on Zoom or in the garden with a few friends, but the conversation hasn't changed at all. It's always on the big issues of the day. When do you think the lockdown levels will change? What do you think of the European Super League? What's going to happen to the high street? When can we go on holiday? When will things get back to normal? We all love trying to predict the future, some with more confidence than others perhaps, but we all love to predict what and when it's all going to happen. Isn't it funny though, how eager we all are to predict the future for other folk, even though we have absolutely no input into their circumstances? However, none of us really likes uncertainty in our lives. We like to know that generally things are going to be okay, that somebody is in charge, that the government has a grip on what is going on and has a handle on the future, and that we just need to do this or that for a short time and it will all work itself out for the best. But when our circumstances deteriorate, we may no longer trust that somebody does actually have a handle on the future. Now, whether that's the government or bosses, but when things go south, we rarely trust that God has a handle on the future. And that's when the fear starts to creep in. And that as our circumstances deteriorate, our faith deteriorates. That the random circumstances of life eat away at the one thing that might just actually hold us all together. Our confidence in God seems to rise and fall as our circumstances change. And as our faith gradually deteriorates, then fears arise. And as I have already said, none of us likes uncertainty in our life. And fear does a strange thing to us, because we don't like not knowing what is ahead, what is going to happen. We certainly don't like waiting to find out. In fact, if some of us had our own way, I'm sure we would rather suffer the problems now rather than postpone the inevitable to somehow become the masters of our fate. During my time in the military, and as a married man with a family, short notice deployments came with their own particular set of difficulties. However, the alternative of the delay and uncertainty associated with deployments planned for months ahead always seemed harder on the family and me. It seemed that no matter how many weeks or months we had to prepare or how organised we tried to be as a family, all that family and house stuff and car stuff and stuff always ended up getting sorted just hours before I left. And disaster always seemed to strike shortly after I got on the plane. Seems funny looking back now, and Jackie and I still raise a wry smile when it comes up in conversation. But I know that I, for one, always preferred the no-notice deployment. Just got on the plane, got it done and got home again, and dealt with the issues as they arose, rather than all that hanging around, not exactly aware of what is going on and just waiting and hoping for the right thing to happen. But of course, left in that situation, all of us, we try to predict the future. We become fortune tellers. We search the news for information, we read the papers, scan the news channels, check the updates on our favourite websites or social media, especially those that support our knowledgeable and fact-based predictions, and of course disregard as foolish anything that might contradict our own personal point of view. And we keep doing it, because we can't stop it. We trust to our wisdom and knowledge, despite all the experience of our past. If you've been following us in this Andy Stanley series of You're Not Far, you will know that we are following the story of Jesus' life, as told by the Apostle Peter and recorded, that is written down by Mark. You'll remember from last week David telling us about Jesus' long journey south through Galilee to Judea and ultimately to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And as the disciples walk and talk with Jesus, he turns their understanding of how things in the world work. He turns it upside down. You know how things are in the world, how authority works, how those people with all the power, money and influence use that power, money and influence to get more power, money and influence. And they're like, yeah, we know how it all works. Well, not so with you. For the way to win favour in God's kingdom is not by personal achievement, it is through service. The desire to be on top will only hinder, not help. Rather than seek to have your own needs met, look for ways that you can minister to others. For even the Son of Man came not to serve, but to serve and to give his life for many. And that must have really confused them. It didn't square with their understanding of what was about to occur when they got to Jerusalem. Isn't Jesus going to declare himself king and to call the people to rise up and lead them against their oppressors? And his last remark really baffled them, and to give his life for many. Then to make matters even more confusing, as they approached Jerusalem, the crowds grew bigger and bigger. Some laying their coats down in front of Jesus, others branches they had cut from the roadside. So much energy, so much excitement. It was like a festival. Emotions were high, and the disciples' predictions were being reinforced by the convictions of the crowd that this was a messianic moment. The people were anticipating what the disciples had predicted, that Jesus was going to proclaim himself king, and the new age that they had been praying for generations was finally here. Surely all that talk of spitting and suffering and dying was all a mistake. Surely Jesus was mistaken. On arrival in the city, Jesus doesn't delay and goes directly to the temple. The disciples would surely be thinking, this is going to be it. But he only looks around at everything. He doesn't speak, he doesn't teach. And then he leaves and returns with the disciples to Bethany, a small town on the outskirts of the city. Next morning they're up early and head back to the city. And this time Jesus really stirs things up by turning over the tables of the money changers and the sellers. Now, a bit of background here. The temple was where you went to get forgiveness for sins. You did this by means of sacrifice. This often required a young animal which could be purchased inside the temple court, paid for with temple currency, which conveniently could be obtained from the money changers in the temple court. Jesus then accuses the chief priests and leaders of turning what was designed as a house of prayer into a corrupt commercial enterprise. Now everybody is upset. The money changers, the sellers, the chief priests and teachers of the law, and very likely the disciples as well. Because from their point of view, as they would see it, they were going to need as many influential friends as they can get if Jesus was going to make a success of this king thing. The chief priests and teachers now set in motion a plan to kill Jesus, but not yet, because they were afraid of the people, because the people were amazed at Jesus' teaching. Once again, Jesus and the 12 spend the night outside the city, only to return to the temple in the morning. But this time, the chief priests and teachers were ready for him. If they could trap him with a trick question and show him up either as a blasphemer or a weird fanatic, then they could separate him from the crowd and have them turn on him. Jesus could then be arrested and executed. So they asked Jesus a couple of tricky questions, to which Jesus replies with a parable. And in the parable, it is clear to the chief priests and the teachers that they are the villains, which must make them even more angry and more determined to get rid of this troublemaker. But they can't do anything yet, because they're still very afraid of the crowd. So they left him and went away to regroup and to come up with some better questions. Sometime later, the Pharisees approached Jesus with their best trick question. And Jesus' reply is a moment of sheer brilliance, possibly the culmination of everything that happened in this season of his earthly ministry. So they are in the temple grounds, and the Pharisees come up to Jesus and they try to disarm him with some smooth talk. "Teacher, we know how honest you are. You are impartial and you don't play favourites. You teach the way of God truthfully." And here was a question, and it's a good question. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or shouldn't we? Now, this tax is a poll tax on every single Judean, regardless of age or gender or whether they are working or not, because everybody pays this tax. The tax was imposed by the Romans when Judea came under Roman rule, which also reminded the people that they were no longer a sovereign state. Everybody hated this tax. But this was a good question, because if Jesus says yes, it gets him in trouble with the Jewish patriots. But if he says no, they shouldn't pay this tax, it gets him in trouble with Rome. So the Pharisees think they've backed Jesus into a corner, and this is Passover season, and anti-Roman feelings are running high. You can imagine the disciples' feelings as they heard this play out to this point. This is a good question. They have come up with a good one this time. How in the world is Jesus going to get out of this one? So here is what happens. Jesus has no money, so he asks the Pharisees, "Show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you." Now, Judean Jews were required to pay the tax with a Roman coin, a denarius. This coin is the equivalent of a daily wage and had the image of Tiberius Caesar on one side with an inscription around the edge which basically said, "Son of the divine Augustus." And on the back it proclaimed Tiberius to be the high priest of the Roman religion. Everything about the coin was offensive to the Jewish people. But that wasn't the worst part, or the best part. One of the Pharisees produces a coin. Somebody had one in his pocket. So Jesus is looking at the coin the Pharisee has in his hand and asks, "Whose image is this?" And at this point, it is game over for the Pharisees. We don't see it, but you can bet the crowd did. And I can imagine that a few of the Pharisees saw it too, only too late, because the Pharisees are carrying around images in their pockets and holding them in their hands. They are breaking one of the 10 Commandments, the Big Ten, within the temple grounds, because Jews are not allowed to have any images. They have no images anywhere, in their homes, in the temple, in the city. This was one of the Big Ten, "Thou shalt not." Jesus continues, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription is this?" "Caesar's," they replied. The Pharisees know it's over. They have been found out with Caesar's image in their pocket at the temple. "Well then," Jesus said, "give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." It says in the text, his reply completely amazed them. I'll bet it did. So the Pharisees go off to lick their wounds and let the Sadducees have a go with their hypothetical question about marriage and the resurrection. Now, the Sadducees were followers of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and they did not believe in life after death or the resurrection. Their hypothetical story is of a woman whose husband dies and then his brother marries her to continue the family line, as was the custom then. And then he dies and another brother marries her, and so on and so on. The question was, who was she married to when she got to heaven? Jesus, equally brilliantly, sidesteps their trap and answers them by telling them, "Your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures," and quoted Moses to them to show the absurdity of their question. And as so-called cult scholars, this would have been rightly offensive to them, but true nonetheless. Jesus and the disciples leave the city, and as they exit the temple, one of the 12 says to Jesus, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the wall." And they were massive stones. Herod had spent a lot of money on the construction of the temple to make it both earthquake-proof and to curry favour with the people. Some of these stones weighed 500 tons. And then Jesus says something extraordinary. "Yes, look at these great buildings. but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. I am fairly sure the disciples would have been thinking, not even an earthquake could do that. It would take an army. And so they continue up to the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city and the temple. And a small group of disciples come to Jesus in secret because they want to know what is going to happen to the city and when. Tell us, when will all this happen? And then Jesus predicts the destruction of the city. He predicts the destruction of the temple. And this is the most verifiable prophecy ever given, and is recorded in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And I'm sure the disciples could never have imagined that such a thing could ever happen. But sure enough, on the 6th of August in the year AD 70, Roman legions broke into the city after a 4-month-long siege. They then completely destroyed the city and tore down the temple, using an army of Jewish slave labour to push the massive temple stones over to the edge of the plaza and tipped them over the edge to where they still lie today. And what Jesus predicted as unimaginable as it was at the time actually came true. And why was this important? Because as Jesus had said earlier, something greater than the temple is here. The old was passing away and the new had come. The temple was becoming obsolete, no longer necessary, because the kingdom of God was near, because the king was in town. Most significant for us is that the us inside of us was every bit as sacred as the temple, because the Spirit of God was about to inhabit his followers. Now Passover was only 2 days away, and nothing was prepared for the festival. So the disciples come to Jesus and asked him, "Where do you want us to go to prepare the Passover meal for you?" And of course, Jesus already has things in hand. As you go into the city, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house where he enters, say to the owner, "The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?" He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. And so they meet a man carrying a jar of water. And what are the chances of that in the city the size of Jerusalem? And they follow him to the house and prepare the Passover meal. When evening came, Jesus and the 12 travelled back into the city. And I'm fairly sure that Peter would have been thinking as they arrived, this has got to be it. This is when Jesus is going to make his move. And it was it, just not the it that Peter was planning on. Here's what happened. While they were eating the Passover meal, Jesus took a piece of bread, and when he had given thanks, broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take it." As they were about to eat it, he said, "For this is my body." Perhaps if Peter had given us a little more information, he might have said, and we all hesitated, "His body?" And then Jesus took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank for it. No going back now. Then Jesus says, "This is my blood, which confirms a covenant between God and his people, which is poured out for many." And it becomes quite evident to everybody that Jesus is making the Passover all about himself, the sacrificial lamb. But hang on, a covenant? We don't need a covenant, we need a kingdom. And we thought you were going to be king. Now for some, it would be days, others weeks, before they understood the real significance of what had just happened, for something was clearly up. But there would have been delight being in the city with Jesus at Passover. Then after singing a hymn, they leave the upper room and make their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. But on the way, Jesus told them, "All of you will desert me." This must have really shocked them. This was not part of the plan. There's going to be a kingdom, and you're going to be king, and we all get to be a part of it. It's all for one and one for all. It certainly shocked Peter, who declared emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you." And all the others vowed the same. When they get to Gethsemane, Jesus is deeply, deeply troubled and goes off to pray. And then there are torches approaching and noise, and Judas arrives with a crowd of men. Peter has a swing at one of them with a sword and cuts off an ear. But it does make you wonder if he was aiming at Judas, who must have ducked at the last moment, and some poor temple guard cops it instead. Then Jesus asked them, "Am I some dangerous revolutionary that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there among you teaching every day." And now Peter makes a decision he is going to regret for the rest of his life, because now there is a gap between what he expected of Jesus and who he expected him to be and what he has experienced. In that moment, Peter lost hope. They all lost hope, and they all deserted him. For clearly Jesus was no king. He was no Messiah. There would be no kingdom. And after all, isn't it human nature to assume the worst about God when circumstances are at their worst? Faith almost always deteriorates when circumstances deteriorate. And in those moments, faith is quickly replaced with fear. And like Peter, we become fortune tellers, sure that we know what the future holds, confident that nobody is holding our future. And if that's you, and when that's me, I think I know what Peter would say to us. He would look at you, and he would look at me, and he would say, "It's okay, I understand. I've been there. In the moment when the future all goes dark, when I went from the follower of a popular rabbi to a fugitive of the law, I remember. I believed the lie and lost hope and deserted him just like all the rest. Everything I felt in that moment led me to believe that God is not near. But friends," he would say to you and to me, but friends, in fact, he was. Now the very men who abandoned Jesus when suddenly their future went dark, and there was a chasm between what they expected and what they had experienced, who fled when he needed them most, are the same men who risked their lives so that you and I can know with certainty that in fact God is near and that you are not far from the kingdom. Please join us as we pray for strength in hardship and for the courage to remain faithful when doubts arise. Father, thank you for the amazing stories of Jesus and for the wisdom that they bring to our lives. We ask that you would strengthen our resolve in hardship and to remain faithful to your plan for our lives, and that you would help us overcome doubt with the knowledge and heartfelt joy that you have our future safely planned out. Thank you that although we may feel at times far from you, that you are in fact always so close to us, and that you are never far, that we are never far from your kingdom. Amen. Because of what happens next in the story, because everything standing in the way between you knowing and experiencing the kingdom has been removed, we hope and pray that you will join us next week for more of your